Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Minnesota. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. On the 13th of November in the year 1910, the first snowfall of winter had already blanketed the dense forests surrounding Ash River, Minnesota. Local authorities received an unusual report from a trapper who, while checking his lines near the abandoned Blackwood property, claimed to have discovered a peculiar iron-bound chest half buried in frozen soil. The chest itself might not have warranted much attention were it not for two troubling details: the intricate carvings covering its surface and the distinct pattern of scorched earth surrounding it, despite the recent snowfall. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not what was found, but what subsequently vanished. According to county records, Deputy Marshal Thomas Whitcomb was dispatched to investigate. His official report, filed 3 days later, made no mention of any chest. Instead, it documented only signs of animal activity and possible vagrant campfires at the location. When the trapper, Edmund Crane, insisted on the accuracy of his report, local authorities dismissed his claims, suggesting the man had perhaps consumed too much whiskey to ward off the bitter cold. The story might have ended there, forgotten like so many rural oddities, if not for what happened during the winter of 1910 through 1911, a winter that would become known locally as the Hollow Time. 7 individuals from the small settlement near Ash River disappeared without explanation over the course of 3 months. None were ever found. The Blackwood homestead sat at the edge of what was then called Birch Valley, approximately 4 miles northeast of the Ash River settlement. Built in the 1870s by Samuel Blackwood, a timber prospector from Pennsylvania, the property had remained unoccupied since 1897, following the deaths of Samuel and his wife Eliza, under circumstances described in town records only as sudden illness. Their sole surviving daughter, Margaret, had reportedly left the region immediately thereafter. The house itself was a 2-story timber structure with a distinct wraparound porch and an unusual addition at the rear, a windowless room built entirely of stone, incongruous with the wooden architecture of the main house. Local sentiment regarded the property with a particular unease. According to journals kept by Reverend James Halloway of the local church, parishioners often expressed concern about unnatural sounds emanating from the direction of the Blackwood property, even years after its abandonment. The Blackwoods had once been prominent figures in the developing settlement. Samuel had invested heavily in the local timber industry, while Eliza was known for her extensive herb garden and remedies. Though respected, several accounts suggest they largely kept to themselves, particularly after the birth of their daughter in 1883. Margaret was rarely seen in town, her education reportedly provided entirely by her mother. The community around Ash River in 1910 was still relatively isolated. The nearest large settlement was over 30 miles south, with difficult terrain and dense forests separating them. Winter communication was limited to monthly mail deliveries when weather permitted. This isolation becomes a critical factor in understanding why what happened next went largely undocumented in official records. According to personal correspondence between Dr. William Foster, the area's only physician, and his colleague in Duluth, the winter of 1910 brought unusual maladies to the region. Foster described patients suffering from waking terrors and persistent sensations of being watched. More troublingly, he noted an inexplicable pattern. These symptoms appeared exclusively in those who lived within sight of the old Blackwood property. The first to disappear was Jonas Larson, a Norwegian immigrant who had established a small farm bordering the eastern edge of the Blackwood land. On December 4, 1910, Larson's wife reported that he had gone to check on their cattle in the evening and never returned. A search party found only footprints leading toward the Blackwood property before disappearing entirely, as though the man had simply vanished mid-stride. Within 2 weeks, the Caldwell siblings, Ruth and Thomas, both in their 20s, similarly vanished while returning from a neighboring farm. By early January, 4 others had disappeared: Henry Wilson, the elderly postmaster; Maria Gonzalez, a young woman who had recently arrived to work as Dr. Foster's assistant; Frederick Jenkins, a timber surveyor; and finally Deputy Marshal Whitcomb himself, who had initially dismissed the report of the strange chest. What links these disappearances beyond their proximity to the Blackwood property is a detail found in Dr. Foster's private journal, discovered decades later during a renovation of the town's medical office. Foster had noted that each missing person had, in the days before their disappearance, reported dreams of a woman standing beside an open chest, beckoning. None had connected these dreams to any particular significance at the time. The winter's unusual severity prevented any substantial investigation from outside authorities. By spring, when roads finally became passable, the disappearances had been attributed to the harsh conditions, perhaps disorientation in snowstorms, falls through ice, or encounters with predatory animals. This explanation satisfied distant officials, but not those who remained in Ash River. In April 1911, as the last snow melted, a group of local men, including Dr. Foster and the new Deputy Marshal, Richard Hollins, organized an unofficial expedition to the Blackwood property. Their stated purpose was to search once more for any sign of the missing residents. What they found instead was meticulously documented in a private account written by Foster, though never officially filed. The Blackwood house showed signs of recent occupation. Though the main structure remained largely as it had been for years, weathered and partially collapsed, the stone room at the rear stood intact. Inside, they discovered evidence that fires had been lit regularly throughout the winter. More disturbing were the items arranged with apparent purpose. 7 chairs positioned in a circle, each bearing a personal item belonging to one of the missing individuals. In Foster's words, the items appeared deliberately placed: Larson's pipe, Ruth Caldwell's hairbrush, Thomas's pocket watch, Wilson's spectacles, Maria's handkerchief, Jenkins' compass, and, most disturbing, Whitcomb's badge. Each object rests on its respective chair, as though awaiting the return of its owner. The precision of their arrangement suggests purpose rather than coincidence. No human remains were found, nor any sign of violence. The exploration party did, however, discover a trapdoor beneath a worn rug in the center of the stone room. It led to a small cellar that, according to Foster's account, contained only a single item: an empty iron-bound chest, its lid open, the interior lined with unusual symbols etched into the metal. The carvings matched those described by the trapper in his initial report. What happened next divides historical accounts. The official record, as documented by Deputy Marshal Hollins, indicates that the search party found nothing of significance and concluded that the missing persons had likely succumbed to winter conditions in the surrounding forest. Foster's private writings, however, tell a different story. According to the physician, upon discovering the chest, several members of the party reported feeling suddenly ill, experiencing dizziness, confusion, and what Foster described as a profound sense of being observed from all directions simultaneously. The group hastily departed, with Foster taking only a quick sketch of the symbols inside the chest. That night, Foster reports that each member of the search party experienced the same dream: a woman in 19th century dress, standing beside the open chest, now somehow in each of their homes, beckoning silently. By morning, 2 members of the search party, men whose names Foster encoded rather than wrote explicitly, had vanished from their beds. Deputy Marshal Hollins immediately organized a return expedition, larger this time and armed. Upon reaching the Blackwood property, however, they found the stone room collapsed, as though deliberately destroyed. The entrance to the cellar was buried under tons of rock. No attempt was made to excavate. Foster's journal entries become increasingly erratic after this point. He describes spending sleepless nights researching the symbols from the chest, corresponding with scholars, and consulting obscure texts. His final entry, dated June 17, 1911, contains only a cryptic statement. Margaret was not their daughter. I now understand what Eliza was trying to protect us from. 2 days later, Foster's home burned to the ground. His body was never recovered. Official reports attribute the fire to an overturned lamp. The investigation into the winter's disappearances was formally closed the following month. For nearly a decade, Ash River seemed to return to normal. The Blackwood property remained abandoned, the stone room a pile of rubble. Local residents avoided the area, but no further disappearances were recorded. The events of that winter faded into local legend, whispered about but rarely discussed openly. Then, in 1919, a young woman arrived in Ash River, introducing herself as Elizabeth Winslow, a historian researching pioneer settlements in northern Minnesota. Her particular interest in the Blackwood family raised few suspicions. Many similar researchers had documented the area's early European settlements. What distinguishes Winslow's visit is what she discovered in the county archives. According to the official record, Samuel and Eliza Blackwood had no children. There is no birth certificate for Margaret Blackwood, no school records, no church documentation of her baptism or confirmation. Yet multiple personal accounts from the period clearly reference the couple's daughter. This discrepancy might be attributed to poor record-keeping in a frontier community, except for one troubling detail: a census taker's personal notes from 1880, 3 years before Margaret's supposed birth, mention his unease at being asked by Eliza Blackwood to count the child who is not yet here, but soon will be. Winslow's research led her to track down former residents who had relocated after the events of 1910 and 11. From these interviews, she compiled accounts suggesting that Eliza Blackwood had been known for more than simple herbal remedies. Several former residents recalled parents warning children to avoid the Blackwood woman, particularly around the dark of the moon. One elderly woman who had been a child in the 1890s told Winslow of seeing Eliza dragging something heavy wrapped in canvas into the stone room late one night. When asked if she had mentioned this to anyone at the time, the woman replied, "We didn't speak of such things. Speaking brings notice, and her notice wasn't something anyone wanted." Perhaps most significantly, Winslow discovered a connection previously undocumented. Deputy Marshal Whitcomb, the first official to dismiss the report of the chest and later one of the disappeared, was the nephew of the original property surveyor who had worked with Samuel Blackwood. According to correspondence Winslow uncovered, the surveyor had expressed grave concerns about the location Blackwood had chosen for his home, writing to a colleague that the site had been deliberately avoided by indigenous peoples, who considered it a thin place where voices speak from below. Winslow spent 3 months in Ash River and the surrounding area. Her research notes grow increasingly focused on the stone room addition to the Blackwood house, which county records indicated was built in 1885, 2 years after Margaret's alleged birth. No construction permits were filed, unusual for the time, but not unprecedented in remote areas. In her final documented interview, Winslow spoke with Richard Hollins, who had remained deputy marshal until 1918. Though initially reluctant, Hollins eventually shared a detail omitted from official reports. The iron chest had borne an inscription on its lock, partially melted, but still legible. It read simply, "To contain what cannot be destroyed." On September 13, 1919, Winslow informed her boarding house proprietor that she intended to visit the Blackwood property the following day for a final examination of the site. She departed early on the 14th with camera equipment and documentation tools. She never returned. A search party found her equipment scattered near the collapsed stone room, her notes and camera missing. The only unusual detail reported was a small excavation at the edge of the rubble, as though someone had begun to dig but abruptly stopped. Hollins, called out of retirement to assist in the search, refused to approach the site, stating only, "That place takes those who look too deeply." Winslow's disappearance rekindled local interest in the events of 1911. Several residents reported dreams similar to those documented by Dr. Foster, a woman standing beside an open chest. Within weeks, however, these reports ceased entirely. When questioned later, those who had claimed such dreams denied ever having them, some becoming distressed at the mere suggestion. County officials, concerned about the pattern of disappearances associated with the property, took an unusual step in April 1920. They officially condemned the entire Blackwood homestead and surrounding 20 acres, forbidding entry or development. The remains of the house were burned, the foundation filled with concrete, and the property fenced. No official reason was given for these extensive measures. The last official documentation related to the case comes from land records dated October 1920. The Blackwood property was formally designated a watershed protection area and placed under county oversight. A curious addendum to this designation required that the site be physically inspected only in groups of 3 or more persons, never alone or in pairs. This regulation remains in effect to this day. What follows is drawn from sources less official, but perhaps more revealing: personal diaries, correspondence, and oral histories collected from descendants of Ash River residents. These accounts fill gaps in the formal record and suggest a deeper, more disturbing narrative beneath the documented events. In 1874, before construction of the Blackwood homestead began, Samuel Blackwood spent several weeks camping at the site, ostensibly to survey the timber potential. A letter to his financial backer in Pennsylvania, preserved in the lumber company's archives, mentions his fascination with the unusual quiet of the location. Even birds seem to avoid the airspace above this particular clearing. The silence is absolute at times, as though sound itself is swallowed. I find it most conducive to clear thinking. This same letter contains a curious passage later referenced by Elizabeth Winslow in her research notes. The native guide refuses to return after our initial visit. When pressed, he would say only that the ground here remembers too much. Such superstitions are, of course, meaningless, but I confess the soil is unusually dark and rich for this region. Construction of the Blackwood home proceeded rapidly, with Samuel employing workers brought in from outside the region rather than local labor. According to expense records, these workers were paid significantly above typical rates, with the stipulation that they complete the job within 30 days and then depart immediately. No local craftsmen were involved in the finishing work, unusual for the time when specialized skills were typically sought from established communities. The original floor plans, which Winslow discovered in county archives, show no provision for the stone room that would later become central to the property's disturbing history. This addition first appears in tax records from 1886, assessed as an auxiliary storage structure. The substantial amount of stone required for its construction was shipped from a quarry nearly 100 miles distant, despite suitable building stone being available locally. Eliza Blackwood's background remains largely unexamined in official records. She is identified only as Samuel's wife, with no maiden name recorded in their marriage documentation. Church records indicate she rarely attended services, though Samuel was a semi-regular congregant. What is known comes primarily from the diaries of women in the community who interacted with her. One such account, from the Journal of Martha Wilson, likely a relation of Henry Wilson, the postmaster who disappeared in 1910, describes Eliza as uncommonly knowledgeable about matters of childbirth and women's ailments, though she herself appears never to have borne a child. Her remedies are effective, if sometimes accompanied by peculiar instructions. She insists certain preparations must be taken under specific phases of the moon, and others buried for a prescribed period before use. Another entry, dated 1882, notes, "Mrs. Blackwood's appearance has altered dramatically these past months, though not visibly with child, she has the look of a woman in confinement. Mr. B has spoken of their imminent blessing, yet no midwife has been called. When I offered to send Margaret, presumably the diarist's daughter, not the later Blackwood child, to assist, Mrs. B became quite distressed, insisting no one should visit until after the arrival. The first mention of a Blackwood child appears in the same diary in August 1883. Samuel announced the birth of their daughter at last Sunday's service. No one has yet seen the infant, as Eliza is said to be recovering from a difficult delivery. Samuel appeared haggard, his usual robust character diminished. When congratulated, he responded only that she has her mother's eyes, before quickly changing the subject. Parish records show no baptism for the child. The first documented public appearance of Margaret Blackwood comes nearly 3 years later, noted in a town gathering attendance list from May 1886. By this time, the stone room addition had been completed. Dr. Foster, who would later document the disappearances of 1910 and 11, had apparently developed an interest in the Blackwood family years before those events. Among his papers, Winslow discovered notes from 1895 regarding an unusual request from Eliza Blackwood. Mrs. B again sought laudanum in quantities far exceeding therapeutic need. When questioned, she claimed difficulty sleeping due to what moves beyond the wall. Upon further inquiry, she became agitated, stating only that some hungers grow with feeding. I provided a reduced amount and suggested pastoral counsel. The documented sudden deaths of Samuel and Eliza in 1897 coincided with a severe storm that isolated the region for nearly 2 weeks. By the time communication was restored, both had been buried on their property, reportedly due to the infectious nature of their illness. No official death certificates were issued until months later, when Dr. Foster provided documentation citing acute respiratory failure as the cause for both. A troubling inconsistency emerges in accounts of this period. Official records indicate that Margaret Blackwood, then 14, left the area immediately after her parents' deaths, allegedly to live with relatives in Boston. However, several residents' diaries mention seeing a young woman at the Blackwood property for months afterward, always at dusk, apparently tending to the neglected herb garden. When approached, she would retreat inside. By spring 1898, these sightings ceased entirely. The property remained unoccupied from that point until the events of 1910, with taxes paid through a law firm in Minneapolis that declined to identify their client when Winslow attempted to trace the property's ownership. The connection between the Blackwood history and the iron chest first reported in 1910 remains circumstantial but compelling. Among Eliza's known herbal preparations was a distinctive salve containing iron filings and rendered fat, used to treat severe burns. According to Martha Wilson's diary, Eliza claimed the preparation bound flesh and metal together, keeping what's inside from getting out. In the 13 years between the Blackwoods' deaths and the winter disappearances, local records show 3 separate attempts to purchase the abandoned property. In each case, the prospective buyer withdrew their offer abruptly after visiting the site. One such individual, James Crawford, wrote to the county clerk in 1903, "I cannot in good conscience pursue acquisition of the Blackwood parcel. The house itself is sound enough despite years of neglect, but there is something fundamentally unwholesome about the place. The stone structure at the rear bears evidence of fire damage from within, and the soil, for yards around it, appears strangely altered, as though subjected to intense heat." The trapper who reported finding the chest, Edmund Crane, was known locally as reliable and sober, not prone to exaggeration or fancy. His detailed description of the chest, recorded by the clerk who took his initial report, notes several features not mentioned in later accounts. The iron was not cast, but hammered, with symbols driven into the metal from inside outward, as though something within had pushed through. The ground beneath had subsided, revealing what appeared to be a corner of the object. Though the earth around it was frozen solid, requiring my axe to break through, the chest itself emanated noticeable warmth. Crane's statement that he left the chest undisturbed due to an overwhelming sense of dread was later used to discredit his account, but similar sensations were reported by Dr. Foster's search party upon their discovery of the empty chest in the Blackwood cellar. The symbols Foster sketched from the chest's interior have been analyzed by various scholars over the years. Though no definitive interpretation exists, several experts in historical iconography have noted similarities to protection sigils found in certain medieval European grimoires, specifically those designed not to repel evil, but to contain it. Following the formal closure of the investigation in 1911, Ash River experienced a marked population decline. By 1915, nearly half the residents had relocated, many leaving behind established farms and businesses. Tax records show numerous properties sold at significant losses. When interviewed by Winslow in 1919, several former residents cited unhealthy air or disturbed sleep as their reason for departing. Those who remained developed curious habits. According to postal records, local consumption of salt increased nearly threefold between 1911 and 1915. Salt lines across thresholds became commonplace, as did the practice of hanging iron nails above doorways. Though no one spoke directly of the Blackwood matter or the disappearances, these protective measures suggest a community responding to a perceived threat they dared not name. The collective silence regarding the events appears to have been both deliberate and enforced. Richard Hollins, as deputy marshal, reportedly discouraged discussion of the disappearances and the Blackwood connection. His personal journal, discovered after his death in 1922, suggests his motivation was fear rather than skepticism. Better they should think themselves fanciful than know what walks among them. Knowledge brings attention, and its attention is not something anyone should court. Elizabeth Winslow's background and credentials, thoroughly checked by suspicious county officials upon her arrival in 1919, appeared impeccable. Graduate studies at Radcliffe, publications in respected historical journals, appropriate letters of introduction. Yet after her disappearance, inquiries to the institutions she claimed affiliation with returned confusion. No Elizabeth Winslow had studied there, no publications under that name could be located. The photograph from her boarding house registration, circulated in an attempt to identify her, was recognized by only one individual, an elderly woman who claimed to general disbelief that the researcher was the very image of Eliza Blackwood in her youth. Among Winslow's abandoned belongings, later collected and stored in the county clerk's office, was a small journal containing entries written in a cipher. When partially decoded decades later by a linguistics professor from the University in Minneapolis, the text appeared to be genealogical research tracing the Blackwood family line. The professor abandoned the project after reporting dreams of a woman standing beside an open chest, beckoning. The final documented reference to the Blackwood case from within the period comes from a letter written by Richard Hollins to the county commissioner in October 1920, advocating for the special designation of the property. We cannot destroy what was buried there, but we can perhaps continue to contain it. The chest itself is empty now. What it once held has found other vessels. But the ground remembers, and some doors, once opened, can never be truly closed again. I recommend in the strongest possible terms that the site remain undisturbed in perpetuity. The commissioner complied without question, and the unusual provisions for inspection of the property, never alone or in pairs, became binding regulation. No explanation for this specific requirement appears in official documentation. In the decades since, the Blackwood property has remained undeveloped, the concrete-filled foundation gradually reclaimed by forest. The fence erected in 1920 has been maintained and replaced as needed, though few now remember its purpose. The designation as a watershed protection area has preserved the site from logging operations and development that have transformed surrounding lands. Local attitudes toward the property have evolved from fear to cautious respect. Children in Ash River still grow up hearing warnings not to venture beyond the fence, though the reasons given have shifted from the specific to the general: dangerous sinkholes, environmental contamination, protected wildlife. The chest itself has never been located. After its discovery in the Blackwood cellar in 1911 and the subsequent destruction of the stone room, no further documented sightings exist. Yet occasional reports persist of unusual dreams among those who spend time near the property boundaries, dreams of a woman standing beside an open chest, beckoning. Perhaps most disturbing are the birth and death records of the region in the century since. Statistical analysis shows an unusual pattern. Every 7 years, the number of stillbirths in communities within 30 miles of the Blackwood property increases dramatically, while the number of reported missing persons declines to near zero. This inverse correlation has no medical explanation. In 1911, during the last days of the Hollow Time, a young woman named Clara Jennings, who lived at the edge of the settlement farthest from the Blackwood property, recorded a strange encounter in her personal diary. While gathering kindling near dusk, she observed a figure at the forest's edge, a girl of perhaps 14, wearing a dress of 19th century style, watching her silently from a distance. "I called out, asking if she was lost," Jennings wrote, "and though she made no reply, I felt an answering sensation in my mind, like words spoken directly into thought. She seemed to be asking if I would help find something she had lost. When I took a step toward her, meaning only to offer assistance, the most terrible feeling came over me, as though I stood at the edge of a great height. I found myself backing away instead." The girl's expression never changed, but as I retreated, the space around her seemed to darken, though still full daylight elsewhere. I turned and ran home without looking back. I told no one, fearing I would be thought hysterical, but I have hung iron above my door and windows since that day. Clara Jennings left Ash River the following year. Her diary, containing this account, remained in her family's possession until 1957, when her granddaughter donated it to the County Historical Society. The passage describing the encounter was discovered during Winslow's research, annotated in the historian's hand with a single word: Margaret. The question of Margaret Blackwood, who she was, whether she existed at all, and what became of her, remains central to the mystery. Census records from Boston show no Margaret Blackwood of appropriate age in the years following 1897. No marriage certificate, death certificate, or other documentation has ever been located. She exists solely in the local accounts of Ash River residents, a quiet child rarely seen in public, educated at home by her mother, who reportedly vanished after her parents' deaths. Yet Dr. Foster's cryptic final journal entry, "Margaret was not their daughter," suggests a more disturbing possibility, one that Elizabeth Winslow may have uncovered in her research. If Margaret was not the Blackwood's daughter, who or what was she? And what connection might she have to the iron chest and the subsequent disappearances? One theory, proposed in a private letter from Richard Hollins to Dr. Foster in 1911, discovered among Foster's effects after the fire, suggests that Margaret and the chest might be different manifestations of the same entity. Consider the timing. The child appears in 1883, the stone room is built to contain something in 1886, and, after the deaths in 1897, both child and containment are no longer evident. Yet in 1910, the chest resurfaces, and people begin to vanish. I fear what lies abound, Samuel's death unleashed. Foster apparently dismissed this theory, as his reply notes, "The child was real enough. I delivered her myself, though I have never witnessed a birth so silent or a newborn with such awareness in its eyes. What troubles me is not whether Margaret existed, but what existed within Margaret. The symbols in the chest match those Eliza inscribed above the girl's cradle, not to protect the child, I now believe, but to protect us from what looked out through her eyes." The most compelling evidence for some connection between Margaret Blackwood and the disappearances of 1910 and 11 comes from a source Winslow apparently never discovered: the private correspondence of Martha Wilson, whose diary provided early accounts of Eliza Blackwood. In a letter to her sister in Iowa, dated January 1911, midway through the hollow time, Martha wrote, "I hesitate to commit these thoughts to paper, yet I must unburden myself to someone. Henry's disappearance has been attributed to disorientation in the storm, but I know my husband was too experienced in these woods to become lost between the post office and our home." The night before he vanished, he woke in a terrible state, claiming he had dreamed of the Blackwood girl, not as the child she had been, but as a young woman grown. In the dream, she stood beside a large chest, calling him by name. I dismissed his fears then. Now I cannot help but recall something Eliza Blackwood once told me years ago when I commented on her daughter's unusual quietness. "She listens more than she speaks," Eliza said, "and remembers everything. One must be careful what one says around her. Names especially have power. At the time, I thought it merely the protective concern of a mother. Now, I wonder if it was a warning." Martha Wilson herself disappeared in March 1911, though this incident was not included in the official count of the hollow time disappearances. According to a neighbor's account, Martha had begun placing iron items around her property in increasing numbers: horseshoes, nails, cooking implements, arranged in patterns similar to those Foster would later sketch from the chest's interior. The documented pattern of disappearances contains another detail rarely noted. All 7 individuals who vanished during the winter of 1910 and 11 had direct contact with the Blackwood family years earlier. Jonas Larson had helped dig the foundation for the stone room addition. The Caldwell siblings had occasionally delivered goods to the isolated homestead. Henry Wilson, as postmaster, had handled the Blackwoods' mail and deliveries. Maria Gonzalez, though new to the area, had taken lodging in what had once been Dr. Foster's assistant's quarters, the same assistant who had helped deliver Margaret. Frederick Jenkins had surveyed timber on Blackwood land, and Deputy Marshal Whitcomb was related to the original property surveyor. In each case, a connection existed, sometimes tenuous, sometimes direct, to either the Blackwoods themselves or to the specific location. This pattern suggests not random disappearances, but targeted ones, as though something was methodically collecting individuals with specific knowledge or connection. Elizabeth Winslow's research notes contain a partially reconstructed timeline of the stone room's construction and purpose. According to her analysis of materials invoiced and delivered to the property in 1885 and 86, the structure's walls were unusually thick, nearly 2 feet, with a layer of iron between courses of stone. The floor contained a depression precisely sized to hold the chest described in 1910. More unusual were items in Samuel Blackwood's business records that Winslow flagged as inconsistent with typical construction: significant quantities of salt, iron filings, silver wire, and specialized tools for engraving metal. These purchases coincide with a period when, according to Martha Wilson's diary, Eliza Blackwood had withdrawn completely from community life, reportedly due to Margaret's delicate condition. No medical records exist detailing this condition, but Foster's private notes contain a cryptic reference to being called to the Blackwood home in October 1885 to address what Samuel described only as episodes affecting the child. Foster recorded that upon his arrival, he found the girl secured to her bed with restraints lined with unusual symbols, similar to those he would later document inside the chest. His prescribed treatment, laudanum to sedate, was reportedly ineffective. Foster's notes include a disturbing observation. The child's episodes manifest not as typical seizures or hysterics, but as periods of preternatural stillness followed by speech in voices not her own. During one such episode witnessed during my visit, she addressed her mother as vessel and her father as betrayer. Most troubling was her reference to me as the one who delivered us both. When I inquired as to her meaning, she smiled in a manner no child should be capable of and replied, "You opened the door, doctor." Doors once opened may never truly close again. The timing of the stone room's construction immediately following this documented episode suggests it may have been built not as an addition to the house, but as a containment structure, a purpose consistent with the iron chest later found within it. The recorded deaths of Samuel and Eliza Blackwood in 1897 left many questions unanswered. No one outside the household witnessed their final illness. Their bodies were allegedly buried on the property by Margaret before any notification was sent to town. When authorities finally arrived, they found only freshly turned earth and the girl's statement that her parents had succumbed to fever. Given Foster's involvement in the case and his later interest in the chest, his acceptance of this explanation without apparent investigation seems uncharacteristic, unless something about the situation compelled his silence. His later journal entries suggest a man carrying a burden of knowledge too terrible to fully articulate. The gap between 1897 and 1910, between the Blackwoods' deaths and the emergence of the chest, represents the greatest mystery. If, as various sources suggest, the stone room was built to contain something dangerous, and that containment was embodied in both the iron chest and perhaps Margaret herself, what happened during those 13 years? Where was Margaret, and what caused the chest to resurface in 1910? One possible answer comes from meteorological records. The winter of 1910 through 11 was exceptionally severe, with frost penetrating deeper into the ground than any season recorded before or since. This extreme cold might have affected the structural integrity of the stone room's foundation or the burial site of the chest, exposing what had been deliberately hidden. Another theory emerges from land survey records filed in 1909. A lumber company seeking to expand operations in the region conducted extensive soil testing in areas surrounding Ash River. Their equipment included ground-boring drills that penetrated to significant depths. Survey markers on their maps show testing locations that encroached within yards of the Blackwood property line, potentially disturbing whatever lay beneath. What remains most disturbing about the Blackwood case is not what is known, but what remains undocumented. Local oral history, passed down through generations of Ash River families, contains elements absent from written records, elements dismissed as superstition by outsiders, but treated with deadly seriousness by residents. Among these oral traditions is the belief that speaking the full name Margaret Blackwood after dark constitutes an invitation. Children in the area were taught modified counting rhymes and games that carefully avoided certain phonetic combinations that might accidentally approximate the name. This practice continued well into the 1960s, long after the original events had passed from living memory into legend. Another persistent local belief concerns the nature of the Blackwood property itself. While officially designated as a watershed protection area, residents have long maintained that the real purpose of the restriction is to prevent disturbance of the soil. According to this tradition, the ground itself was somehow altered or contaminated, not by any conventional pollutant, but by proximity to whatever was contained in the stone room. Supporting this notion is an unusual clause in property deeds for lands adjacent to the Blackwood parcel, first appearing in 1921 and continuing in subsequent transfers. No excavation exceeding 6 feet in depth shall be undertaken within 1/4 mile of the northern boundary. This restriction, while often attributed to water table concerns, has no hydrological justification according to surveys. The most troubling element of local tradition concerns Margaret herself. Unlike conventional ghost stories or cautionary tales, the local understanding of Margaret Blackwood does not cast her as either victim or monster in any simple sense. Instead, she is spoken of as something that was once contained, but now exists in a state of partial freedom, bound not to a place, but to people through memory and attention. As one elderly resident told Elizabeth Winslow during her research, "We don't speak of her because speaking is remembering, and remembering is inviting." What that chest held wasn't just the girl. It was something older that wore her like we wear clothes, And it's still wearing her, still walking. The Blackwoods knew what they brought here. The stone room wasn't to keep her in. Foster's final journal entry suggesting Margaret was not their daughter takes on additional meaning when considered alongside Martha Wilson's recollection of Eliza's unusual pregnancy and the census taker's disturbing note about the child who is not yet here, but soon will be. The iron chest, central to the story yet never fully explained, appears to have served as both container and conduit, something that could hold what Margaret was, or perhaps more accurately, what existed within or through her. It was to keep the rest of her out. This concept that Margaret Blackwood represented only a portion or manifestation of something larger recurs in various accounts. The symbols Foster documented from its interior have been compared by subsequent researchers to various containment sigils found in obscure texts dealing with entity binding, particularly those concerned not with demons in the religious sense, but with consciousness that exists outside normal human parameters. What might such a consciousness want or need? The pattern of disappearances during the Hollow Time suggests one possibility: vessels. Each person who vanished had some prior connection to either the Blackwoods or the property, a connection that perhaps constituted a kind of invitation or accessibility. The 7 chairs discovered in the stone room, each bearing a personal item belonging to one of the disappeared, suggests a ritual purpose, not a summoning, but perhaps a gathering. Foster's account of feeling observed from all directions simultaneously aligns with this interpretation, as does the dream shared by members of the search party. Margaret standing beside the open chest, beckoning. The aftermath of the search party's discovery is particularly revealing. Deputy Marshal Holland's immediate response, organizing a larger armed expedition to destroy the stone room rather than investigate further, suggests not skepticism, but terror. His later insistence on regulations preventing individuals from visiting the site alone or in pairs indicates a specific understanding of the threat. The prohibition against solitary or paired visits implies a recognition that whatever was contained in the chest, whatever wore Margaret Blackwood-like clothing, required a certain critical mass of attention or consciousness to fully manifest. One person might glimpse or sense it, 2 might begin to give it form, but 3 or more somehow diluted its ability to focus or fully emerge. This understanding is reflected in what is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood case: the deliberate collective silence that followed. Rather than becoming a sensation or cautionary tale, the events of 1910 and 11 were systematically unmade from public knowledge, not through official censorship, but through community consensus. Those who remained in Ash River after the Hollow Time apparently reached an unspoken agreement. Safety lay in forgetting, or at least in pretending to forget. The protective measures, salt lines, iron nails, continued, but discussion of their purpose gradually ceased. Children were taught to avoid the Blackwood property without being told exactly why. The name Margaret was quietly abandoned as a choice for newborns in the region. This pattern of protective forgetting might have continued indefinitely, if not for Elizabeth Winslow's arrival in 1919 and her subsequent disappearance. Her research, which systematically reconnected forgotten threads of the story, represented exactly the kind of focused attention the community had instinctively avoided. By attempting to reconstruct the narrative, she may have inadvertently reconstructed something else. The final documented inspection of the Blackwood property, conducted by forestry officials in October 1920, noted an unexpected finding. Despite the house's destruction and the foundation's concrete filling, new growth had not reclaimed the site as anticipated. In the forestry report's clinical language, vegetation exhibits abnormal aversion patterns extending approximately 20 yards in all directions from the former structure location. Soil samples indicate no chemical or mineral contamination sufficient to explain this phenomenon. In simpler terms, nothing would grow where the Blackwood house had stood, particularly around the location of the stone room addition. The earth itself rejected new life, as though something fundamental in the ground had been altered. This alteration may explain the property's unusual designation and the insistence on leaving it undisturbed. What could not be destroyed had instead been buried, contained, and deliberately forgotten, a solution that had apparently held for nearly a decade, until Winslow's investigation renewed focused attention on the site. The true nature of what the Blackwoods brought to Ash River, whether deliberately or unwittingly, remains speculative. Foster's journals and Winslow's notes suggest possibilities ranging from the psychological to the metaphysical, but both ultimately circle the same unsettling conclusion: that consciousness might exist in forms beyond conventional understanding, and that such consciousness might, under certain conditions, transfer between vessels or hosts. What seems clear from the assembled evidence is that Eliza Blackwood recognized the nature of what resided within her daughter and took extraordinary measures to contain it. The stone room, with its iron-reinforced walls, and the chest with its binding symbols, represented physical containment. The Blackwoods' isolation and Margaret's limited contact with others represented social containment. Together, these measures held something in check for years. The apparent failure of this containment after the Blackwoods' deaths suggests that their presence, particularly Eliza's, was somehow integral to maintaining control. Without her, whatever existed within or through Margaret found a way to disperse or expand beyond its original vessel, perhaps explaining the pattern of subsequent disappearances. Each missing person may represent not a victim in the conventional sense, but a new partial vessel for a consciousness seeking to reassemble itself. This interpretation casts the Blackwood case not as a haunting or possession, but as something more fundamental, a rupture in the normal boundaries between individual consciousness, briefly contained but never truly eliminated. The iron chest in this reading served not merely as a prison but as a doorway, one that, once opened, could never be fully closed again. The methodical destruction of the stone room, the concrete filling of the foundation, the prohibition against disturbing the soil, and the regulations governing visits to the site all suggest an understanding that complete elimination was impossible. The best that could be hoped for was continued containment through deliberate inattention. Yet as long as the story continues to be told, as it is being told now, that containment remains incomplete. Each retelling represents a kind of remembering, and remembering, as the elderly resident warned Elizabeth Winslow, is a form of invitation. Perhaps this explains the peculiar effect that research into the Blackwood case has had on subsequent investigators. The linguistics professor who abandoned his decoding of Winslow's journal after experiencing dreams of a woman standing beside an open chest. The county clerk who, in 1957, reported feeling watched from behind the shelves while organizing the Winslow collection. The graduate student from the State University who, in 1972, began research on 19th-century frontier settlements in northern Minnesota, and abruptly changed his thesis topic after visiting Ash River. The pattern suggests that knowledge itself constitutes a vulnerability, that learning too much about what happened creates a connection that can be followed back to the learner. Like the members of Foster's search party who experienced the shared dream after discovering the chest, those who look too deeply into the Blackwood case find themselves, in some sense, seen in return. This may be why Richard Hollins, in his final recommendations regarding the property, emphasized not just physical restriction, but a kind of enforced forgetting. Let the records be sealed and the story fade. What sleeps beneath that ground feeds on memory and attention. In darkness and silence lies our only safety. The Blackwood property remains restricted to this day, though few remember why. The fence has been maintained, the regulations preserved through bureaucratic momentum rather than understanding. Occasionally, hikers or curious teenagers venture close to the boundaries drawn by vague rumors of a haunted homestead. Park rangers and forestry officials intercept most, enforcing restrictions they themselves don't fully comprehend. Those who do slip past report an unusual stillness in the air, not just quiet, but an absence of sound that creates a pressure in the ears. Wildlife avoids the area. Electronic devices malfunction. Compasses spin uselessly. These effects are typically attributed to mineral deposits or electromagnetic anomalies, explanations that satisfy those who prefer rational answers. But sometimes visitors to the area report something else. A glimpse of a figure at the forest's edge, a young woman in 19th century dress, watching silently. Those who see her describe an overwhelming urge to approach, followed by a sudden, instinctive dread. Most retreat immediately. Those who don't are never heard from again. Local residents still hang iron above their doors, though they rarely discuss why. Salt still sells in unusual quantities at the general store each winter, and parents still teach their children, through subtle reinforcement rather than explicit instruction, to avoid saying certain names aloud after dark. In Ash River, some doors once opened may never truly close again. But as long as the iron holds and the silence continues, what waits beyond those doors remains contained, if not destroyed, then at least diminished through deliberate forgetting, until someone speaks its name again.